Rome, 3 in the morning. The year is 955, and inside the marble corridors of the Lateran Palace, a boy who should be worrying about his first love instead staring at his hands like they belong to a stranger. His name is John, he's 18 years old. And he is the Pope, God's voice on earth, infallible, untouchable, absolute. Right now, in this exact moment, he's walking through candle-lit hallways, his white papal robes sweeping across ancient stone, and something inside his mind is screaming. Not a sound anyone else can hear, a silent scream that echoes in the place where his conscience used to be. Because John has discovered something terrifying about human nature. When you give a teenager unlimited power and tell him he can never be wrong, you don't create a saint. You create a monster. The human mind has a remarkable ability to compartmentalize. You can do unspeakable things during daylight hours and convince yourself it isn't really happening. You can wear sacred robes and speak holy words and perform Mass for thousands of faithful believers, looking into their trusting eyes as they kneel before you. And in those moments, you can almost believe you're what they think you are. You can speak the words of Christ and pretend you mean them. You can bless pilgrims and tell yourself the blessing is real. But then the sun sets, and the women start arriving. And you become something else entirely, something you don't even want to name. Something that exists in the darkest corner of what humans are capable of when all restraints are removed. To understand how this happened, how an 18-year-old boy became the architect of systematic horror inside the holiest building in Christendom, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand the machine that created him. John's father was Albrecht, not a king or legitimate noble, but a warlord who ruled Rome through sheer brutality. He understood power in its rawest form. Control through fear, dominance through violence. The absolute certainty that opposition meant destruction. But if Albrecht was the instrument of violence, John's mother Marozia was something far more dangerous. She was the architect. Even in an era accustomed to scandal, when popes had mistresses and cardinals fathered illegitimate children, people whispered about Marozia. She had borne children to multiple men. She had orchestrated papal elections. She had poisoned enemies. She had built alliances through seduction and destroyed them through cunning. She understood that in a world where men held official power, the most dangerous woman was one who could wield that power while remaining invisible. When Albrecht died in 954, Marozia saw her opportunity. Her teenage son needed to become pope, not through years of study or spiritual preparation, but immediately, while she still lived, while she could guide him, while she could use him to consolidate everything her family had built. She understood something fundamental. The Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He controlled Rome, he commanded armies. He issued laws, he controlled unimaginable wealth. He appointed bishops across all of Christendom. He could start wars or end them. He could declare anyone a heretic and have them burned alive. And most crucially, he couldn't be questioned. Because everyone in that world had been taught since birth that the Pope was infallible, that his word was God's word, that opposing him meant opposing God himself. Disagreeing with the Pope meant disagreeing with the voice of heaven. If you're drawn to dark history that the powerful spent centuries trying to bury, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next, what John did and what was done to him, what the institutions sacrificed to hide it, that's the kind of truth they never wanted you to know. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I want to know which parts of the world are hearing these stories that were meant to stay buried forever. At 16, John was made a cardinal. A ceremonial gesture. Really, just marking him as the future pope. Letting everyone know this boy had the backing of Rome's most powerful family. 2 years later, in 955, John was elected pope. Think about what that means. An 18-year-old barely out of adolescence, barely shaving, suddenly given out power over millions of souls. Given control of vast wealth, given command of armies, given the authority to declare himself infallible, given the assurance that nothing he did could be questioned because he spoke for God. The cardinals who voted for him weren't choosing a spiritual leader. They weren't even pretending. They were choosing someone young enough to control, young enough to manipulate, young enough to follow instructions without moral objections that older men might raise. Someone still malleable, someone whose conscience might not be fully formed. They got exactly what they wanted, just not in the way they expected. The first few months, John tried. He performed ceremonies. He crowned kings. He signed documents. The cardinals probably thought everything was perfect. Then the servants started noticing things. He wandered the palace at night, sleepless, walking corridors like he was searching for something he couldn't find. His eyes changed, like someone who had seen something that couldn't be unseen. He stopped eating regular meals. He disappeared for hours into the library, pulling down manuscripts most popes never touched. Texts about theology, about authority, about whether what the church taught was actually true. But the most noticeable change came around month 5. That's when the women arrived. At first, just one. A pilgrim who had traveled to Rome to see the Holy Father. She was brought to his chambers late one evening. By morning, she was gone. Guards escorted her out, probably gave her money, probably told her to keep quiet. She would return home carrying knowledge she couldn't speak about, carrying shame that wasn't hers to carry. Then another pilgrim came, then another. Within weeks, there was a steady stream of women being led into the papal quarters, and what happened behind those doors would transform the Lateran Palace into something that shouldn't exist in the house of God. The chronicler Liutprand of Cremona lived in Rome during John's reign. He witnessed what was happening, and he wrote about it with barely concealed horror, calling the Lateran Palace the worst brothel in Rome. But that word, brothel, it's inadequate. Brothels are businesses. This was something else entirely. This was the systematic use of absolute power to access women's bodies. This was a teenager discovering that godlike authority has no limits, and once you discover limits don't apply to you, stopping becomes nearly impossible. The women came for different reasons, but none of them could refuse. Some were pilgrims who had saved for years to make the journey to Rome, who had prayed daily that they might see the Holy Father, who had been promised by their priests that this would be the greatest spiritual experience of their lives. They had no idea what awaited them. Some were daughters of noble families, girls whose parents brought them to Rome hoping papal attention might improve marriage prospects or family standing. Parents who, if they thought about what might happen in those chambers, didn't allow themselves to fully contemplate it. And some were serving girls who worked in the palace, girls with no powerful families to protect them, girls who understood clearly that if the Pope wanted them, they went. Because what were they going to do? Say no to God's representative on earth. Here's the psychological trap of absolute authority combined with claims of infallibility. If the Pope was infallible, if his authority came directly from God, then whatever he did must be acceptable, must be part of God's plan. The idea that the Pope could do something wrong was theologically impossible, because his wrongness would make God's judgment wrong, and God couldn't be wrong, so the women must have done something to deserve it. Or they misunderstood what happened, or they were lying. Or, most insidiously, if they participated, they had consented, and therefore nothing was wrong. This is how systems of absolute power function. Once authority and infallibility exist together, the authority figure becomes untouchable, not just legally, but morally, because touching them morally requires admitting the entire system is built on a lie. One woman became particularly important to John. Her name was Stephana. She had been his father's concubine, and when Albert died, she transferred to John's attention. This wasn't unusual for the time. Women who belonged to fathers often belonged to sons. But what John did revealed how completely he believed in his own authority. He impregnated her, leaving evidence of what he'd done growing inside her body for everyone to see. Then, when he was finished with her, he simply moved on to the next woman. The accounts that survive describe John with dozens of women. Not dozens in a loose sense. The word used in the Chronicles is innumerable. When medieval chroniclers used that word, it meant they gave up counting. There were so many victims they couldn't keep track anymore. These women would be locked in palace rooms, violated repeatedly, then released, traumatized and shamed, to somehow make their way home. They would carry this experience forever. They would never speak about it because who would believe them? The Pope was infallible. If they claimed he'd raped them, they were claiming something impossible. They would be destroyed as liars. Their families would be destroyed as spreaders of vile accusations against the Holy Father. So they kept silent, which meant the rapes continued, which meant more women were victimized, which meant the pattern perpetuated itself. But what happened next shocked even the chroniclers who had documented everything else. According to testimony compiled at the Synod of Rome in 963, the official church council, where John's crimes were finally formally documented, John had sexual relations with his own sisters. Both of them, sisters who shared his blood, who had grown up in the same palace. And not just his sisters, he also violated his niece, his own blood relative. These weren't rumors whispered by enemies. These were testimonies given by eyewitnesses in an official ecclesiastical proceeding. Cardinal Benedict, a high-ranking official who worked in the palace, stood before an assembly of bishops and testified that he had personally witnessed John in bed with Stephana. He didn't testify reluctantly, he simply stated what he had seen, as if describing common knowledge. Because it was common knowledge, everyone in the palace knew. Everyone in the upper echelons of the church knew. This wasn't a secret. This was an open scandal that everyone knew about and everyone was pretending didn't exist. The incest created a theological crisis the church was entirely unprepared to handle. Incest was a mortal sin, one of the gravest, violating not just Christian law, but natural law as understood by medieval theology. Kings had been deposed for less, men had been executed for incest, but the man committing it was supposedly infallible. He was God's representative on earth. He couldn't be wrong about anything. So here was the impossible contradiction. Either the Pope was infallible, in which case his incest must somehow be acceptable, which it obviously wasn't, or the Pope wasn't actually infallible, in which case the entire theological foundation of the Catholic Church was a lie. The Church simply refused to choose. They didn't acknowledge it. They didn't attempt to reconcile it with doctrine. They pretended it wasn't happening. Even as John continued, the nuns became a particular obsession. They were convents attached to the palace, women who had taken religious vows, women who had devoted themselves entirely to God, women who belonged to no man. John decided his authority as Pope superseded their vows. If you were a nun in Rome during those years and John wanted you, guards would come to your convent, you would be brought to his chambers, you would be violated, then sent back. Everyone around you would know what happened, but no one would say anything because the Pope was infallible. Therefore, what happened couldn't actually be what you thought it was. The psychological damage was immense. A nun's entire identity was wrapped up in her vows, her dedication to God, her refusal of carnal relations. John violated all of that, not just bodies, but the very foundation of spiritual identity. By 960, John was also taking male lovers. The accounts describe him holding orgies at the Vatican palace. Medieval chroniclers struggled to describe what they found disturbing and weren't sure how to categorize, but what they're describing is clear. John was coercing sexual encounters with anyone he wanted, regardless of gender. This wasn't about desire. This was about demonstrating that his authority extended everywhere, that no one was safe, that his power was absolute and could be deployed for anything. The palace itself had become unrecognizable. The Lateran Palace, where holy popes had supposedly lived in prayer and contemplation, had been transformed into what Liutprand called a house of vice. Women were being held prisoner. Sexual violence was happening constantly. It had become a place of systematic horror, and John was the architect of all of it. But then something shifted. Around 960, servants noticed his energy changed. The frantic predation seemed to slow. He started spending hours in the library again, but different this time, reading theological texts with the intensity of someone looking for answers to questions tearing him apart. What had he discovered? What could possibly shake a man who had spent years committing atrocities with complete impunity? Historians have theories. One suggests John began to realize something fundamental. His entire worldview was a lie. He had been taught his entire life that he was infallible, that he spoke for God, that his authority came from heaven. But, if that was true, then everything he was doing should be acceptable, should be part of God's plan. And yet something inside him, some fragment of conscience that hadn't been completely destroyed by absolute power, was screaming that this wasn't right, that he wasn't infallible, that he was just a teenager who had been given godlike power and was using it to destroy people. That contradiction became unbearable. John's reign ended not with divine judgment, but with politics. In 963, he was deposed by a church council, his crimes finally documented in official testimony. He died shortly after, at 27, leaving behind a legacy of horror that the church spent centuries trying to bury. But the questions his story raises remain. What happens when we give absolute power to the young and impressionable? What happens when we tell someone they're infallible? What happens when institutions value their own authority more than the people they claim to serve? Comment below with your thoughts. When power has no limits and authority claims to be beyond question, what prevents the next John from emerging? Because the scariest part of this story ain't what happened in 955. It's realizing that the same dynamics that created Pope John XII, the mechanisms of absolute power combined with claims of divine authority, still exist in institutions around the world today. The real question, and how could this happen? It's how do we ensure it never happens again?